Chapter 1, The Penance in the Rain. Those were the 3 hours my 11-year-old spent shivering in the downpour, and that was the single-word bomb I dropped to preserve my dignity. It was that distinct, bone-chilling November dampness of Oregon, the air heavy with the scent of rotting leaves and wet earth. Leo's raincoat was discarded in the entryway, and he himself, like a stray dog cast out, was being relentlessly battered by the rain on the backyard swing set. When I pushed open the heavy oak door upon returning home, there was no warm conversation waiting for me, only the sharp, grating clatter of porcelain from the kitchen. My mother, Evelyn, sat gracefully at the dining table, holding a piece of expensive British bone china. She looked like a grandmother plucked from the pages of a lifestyle magazine, silk blouse and pearl gray, hair pulled back into a flawless bun, even the fine lines around her eyes etched with carefully cultivated benevolence. "You're late, Claire," she said without turning, her voice as steady as if she were discussing tomorrow's weather. "And your son clearly needs some time to reflect on his lack of manners." I felt the blood hammering against my eardrums, that suffocating sense of control flooding back like a rising tide. I didn't answer. I bypassed the table, coat still on, and stumbled toward the backyard. The rain was heavier than I'd imagined, my leather shoes sank into the sodden mud, emitting a wretched squelch. Leo stood with his back to me, that thin hoodie plastered against his lean frame. He wasn't crying, just hanging his head, his fingers gripped white-knuckled around the swing chains from the sheer cold and terror. The moment I touched his shoulder, the boy shuddered violently, his body instinctively curling into a ball. "Leo." My voice sounded shattered and thin against the roar of the rain. He turned his head. Those normally bright eyes were hollow and gray. His lips were a sickly shade of violet, and his teeth chattered as he spoke. "Grandma said, she said I was rude, that I'd dirted her precious rug, so I had to stay here, until the rain stopped." In that moment, something deep within me snapped. It wasn't about the rug, nor the manners. I knew Evelyn too well. This was one of her rituals. She used this near-abusive silence to prove she still held absolute interpretive power in this house. She needed to humiliate my son to trigger my guilt, thereby cementing her status as the backbone of the family. I pulled him into my arms, the freezing dampness of him seeping through my coat and into my bones. At that moment, I didn't scream or hysterically accuse, I felt a near-absurd sense of calm. I carried him inside and kicked open the kitchen door. Evelyn was stirring sugar into her tea, the motion deliberate and unhurried, as if this were all nothing more than a trivial farce. "He's sick, Mother." I stood at the kitchen doorway, nudging Leo toward the stairs. "Give him a hot shower, and stop letting him near your precious tea sets." Evelyn looked up, offering that signature, pitying smile. "Claire, learn to be grateful. I'm helping you discipline him. If you continue this weakness, what will he become? Like you? A mediocre woman who just stares at her garden?" She set down her teaspoon with a crisp clink. It was the trademark signal that her lecture was concluded. "If you want to continue living here, you must follow the rules. I am the head of this house. Out." I said the word. It wasn't loud, but in the silent kitchen heavy with the scent of coffee and cold air, it struck like a hammer, shattering every layer of her facade. Evelyn froze. The teacup in her hand wobbled, spilling amber liquid onto her expensive silk blouse, creating a messy stain. That exquisite, lightly made-up face contorted with sheer shock for a fleeting second. In my memory, she was always the one in control, always the arbiter standing on moral high ground, looking down at the rest of us. I turned my back on her, ignoring the shock and fury in her eyes, and walked briskly toward the stairs. Downstairs, Evelyn finally recovered from her stupor. Her high-pitched voice pierced the sound of the rain, snaking down the hallway like a viper. "Claire, do you have any idea what you're saying? I am your mother. Are you questioning my authority? You ungrateful." I slammed Leo's bedroom door, shutting out the curses and the screaming behind the heavy solid wood. My hands were shaking violently, but I knew that from this moment on, the shell known as the dutiful daughter had been shed by my own hand. I sat by Leo's bed, listening to his breathing steady in the warmth of the bathroom, feeling as though the rain outside had finally ceased. But the real storm had only just begun. I checked my watch. There was still a long night ahead before I could fully sever these ties. Evelyn wouldn't let it go easily. She was the kind of monster who would destroy everyone around her just to maintain a perfect image. And I was ready to rebuild everything on the ruins. This chapter is complete. You may input continue to the next chapter. Chapter 2, The Elegant Ruins. The morning air remained damp, but it carried that particular chill that clears the mind. When I walked into the kitchen, the usual scent of Evelyn's favorite Earl Grey was gone, replaced by a suffocating stillness. On the dining table, the bone china teacup from yesterday, still bearing the tea stain, sat lonely on its tray, as if accusing me of some heinous blasphemy. Evelyn was nowhere to be found, and her precious family photo album, always prominently displayed, was gone, too. That woman, once frustrated in a power struggle, her reflex was always to divest. She was withdrawing her ubiquitous attention, attempting to use this physical cold shoulder treatment to induce panic in me. Leo peeked from the stairs, remnants of last night's terror still lingering in his eyes. He asked me quietly, "Mom, is Grandma really leaving?" "Her car is still in the garage." "She'll leave, Leo," I said, pouring him a glass of warm milk, my voice steady enough to surprise even myself. "When she realizes this place no longer provides the audience she requires, she'll withdraw on her own, like an washed-up actress being kicked off a movie set." Leo scratched his head and couldn't help but chuckle. "When she was yelling at me yesterday, her dentures were rattling." I was tickled by his sudden jab. Leo was a talented observer. He always managed to snag a few fragments from heavy atmospheres and piece together the absurdity of adults like a puzzle. It was the first time I felt that perhaps this child was far stronger than I had imagined. At 10 a.m., the notification pings from our community group chat started firing like a frantic chorus of cicadas. It was our neighborhood's anonymous forum, where Evelyn held the title of honorary moderator. On my screen, her long post was filled with that nauseatingly passive-aggressive tone. "In this rainy season, some hearts grow cold as well. As a mother who has given her all to care for her daughter's family, I am heartbroken. When discipline becomes an excuse to shut someone out, what dignity is left in the family we strive to uphold?" Predictable. She was attempting to use public opinion to paint me as a mean, unfilial, perhaps even mentally unstable daughter. The neighbors' replies poured in, mostly that hypocritical brand of sympathy. "Oh, Evelyn, you are always so hardworking," or "Claire has indeed looked very stressed lately." I methodically finished my last bite of oatmeal and wiped my mouth. I didn't reply with anything defensive. Instead, I opened a private photo album folder I had kept hidden for years. It contained all the social truths I had gathered about Evelyn over the past 5 years. Instances like her shoving expensive cutlery into her purse after getting drunk at a charity gala, her vicious private judgments of the young mothers in the community, and the time she intentionally tipped over an elderly neighbor's potted plant just to win a display space at a community gathering. I didn't need to justify myself. Justification is a tool for the weak. What I was about to do was display this series of elegant ruins and let those who once swarmed around her see the cheap set design behind the performance. Leo leaned against me, watching my fingers dance across the screen. Chapter 3, The Shattering of the Porcelain. The living room fell into a silence so dense you could carve it. Evelyn stepped inside, her high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood, a sound that usually signaled her dominance. But today, the sound lacked its usual authority, it echoed like a hollow warning. Mrs. Higgins hovered in the entryway, looking as though she'd rather be anywhere else, perhaps scrubbing a public restroom than standing in the middle of this domestic minefield. "Evelyn," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Before we discuss my intervention, let's look at some family history. It's important to stay grounded, isn't it?" I didn't wait for her permission. I tapped my phone screen, and the smart TV on the wall flickered to life. I had synced the private album to the living room display. The first image was crisp and damning, Evelyn, blurry-eyed and disheveled at the May charity gala, surreptitiously sliding a silver-plated sauce boat into her oversized designer handbag. It was a still frame from the venue's security footage, a file I had acquired months ago through a contact in the catering business. Evelyn's face went from an arrogant porcelain white to a blotchy, furious crimson. Claire. Turn that off. This is an invasion of privacy. You are insane. Is it insane to document the truth? I walked toward her, my pace slow and deliberate. Or is it just inconvenient for your narrative, Mother? I swiped to the next slide. It was a screenshot of a private thread where Evelyn had ruthlessly mocked Mrs. Higgins' weight and the cheapness of her home decor. Mrs. Higgins, who had been staring at her feet, suddenly whipped her head up, her face turning a shade of shock that quickly curdled into genuine, icy rage. Evelyn? Mrs. Higgins whispered, her voice trembling. Did you say that about my guest room? It was a joke, Martha. She's hacking my accounts. She's doing this to manipulate you. Evelyn's composure had fully evaporated. She began to pace, her hands fluttering in the air, the elegant veneer completely shattered. She looked like what she was, a desperate woman clutching at fraying threads. I didn't stop there. I pulled up the audio clip from the previous night, the cold, sharp sound of her voice telling Leo to stay in the rain until he learned his place. The house was suddenly filled with the sound of the storm and the cruelty of her tone. Leo was watching from the stairs, his small hands gripped tight on the railing. He didn't look scared anymore, he looked enlightened. I didn't do that. That's edited. That's AI generated. Evelyn shrieked, lunging for my phone. She tripped over her own suitcase, and the expensive leather case tumbled open, spilling its contents across the floor, a collection of items she had acquired from neighbors, including the very sauce boat from the gala. The evidence lay scattered on the rug like a confession. You aren't the victim here, Evelyn, I said, my voice cold and devoid of any lingering resentment. You are just a lonely, greedy woman who needs to feel superior to exist. But today, the audience has walked out. Mrs. Higgins didn't say a word. She simply turned around, walked out the front door, and pulled it shut with a finality that echoed throughout the house. Evelyn was left kneeling on the floor, surrounded by her stolen trinkets, her mascara running in dark, jagged tracks down her cheeks. She looked up at me, her eyes darting around for a way out, for a lie, for a shred of sympathy. Claire, please, she rasped, her voice broken. We can talk about this. Don't do this to me. I'm your mother. You are a woman who left my son in the rain, I replied. And that is all you will ever be in this house. I walked to the door and held it open. The wind from outside swept into the room, blowing away the last remnants of her carefully constructed life. This chapter is complete. You may continue to the next chapter. Mom, what are you doing? Helping Grandma prepare for her farewell performance. I closed my phone and glanced out the window. The hydrangeas in the garden looked heavy after the rain. I stood up, walked over, and snipped off a withered leaf. By afternoon, the knock at the door arrived as scheduled. Evelyn had returned, carrying an exquisite leather suitcase, followed by her loyal advocate, Mrs. Higgins from the community board. She hadn't come to apologize. She had come to deliver an ultimatum. Her well-preserved face was masked with that nauseating look of a preordained victor. She had assumed that by bringing a witness, I would be forced to bow my head to save face. Claire, she stood at the door, her voice dripping with forced pity. I've spoken with Mrs. Higgins. If you cannot guarantee respect for your elders, for the sake of Leo's upbringing, we believe you need a little, mandatory psychological intervention. Watching Mrs. Higgins behind her, who looked incredibly awkward and was clearly dragged along against her will, I couldn't help but curl the corners of my lips. Mandatory intervention? I stepped aside, making a gesture for them to enter, my voice as light as if I were welcoming an old friend. Perfect. I was just about to discuss who here is in need of a reality check. Evelyn froze. She hadn't expected the hysterical argument she had prepared for, she hadn't expected this eerie, calm welcome. In that instant, her expression was magnificent, like a gladiator who had prepared a long sword, only to find her opponent holding a camera. This chapter is complete. You may input continue to the next chapter. Chapter 4, The Isolation of the Queen. The front door didn't just close, it sealed a tomb. Evelyn remained on the floor, the silver-plated sauce boat sitting beside her like a silent witness to her undoing. The silence that followed was heavy, textured with the debris of her social suicide. I didn't offer a hand. I didn't offer a tissue. I simply stood there, watching the woman who had spent 30 years architecting the perfect life now staring at the splintered remains of her own ego. Get up, I said. It wasn't a request. She struggled to her feet, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. The refined matriarch was gone, replaced by a frantic, aging woman who suddenly looked every one of her 70 years. She stumbled toward the hallway mirror, catching a glimpse of her smeared makeup. She didn't fix it. She seemed to realize that no amount of powder could cover the cracks I had just exposed. You think you've won? She hissed, though the venom lacked its usual sting. The community board? The charity circle? They won't believe a digital smear campaign. I have allies, Claire. I have history. You have people who fear your judgment, Evelyn. Not allies, I corrected, my voice rhythmic and calm. And as for the smear campaign? The evidence is already circulating. By tomorrow, your name will be a punchline in every parlor in this town. I pulled out my phone and watched the notification feed. It was a digital wildfire. The screenshots I'd leaked to a few key neighborhood influencers, women who had long endured Evelyn's condescension, were being shared with the kind of ferocity that only long-suppressed resentment can generate. The phone began to buzz in her coat pocket. Then it rang again. And again. She pulled it out, her fingers trembling. Hello? Yes, this is Evelyn, what? I don't know what you're talking about, her face drained of all remaining color as she listened to the caller. She dropped the phone onto the hardwood, it clattered, the screen cracking. That was the chair of the charity board, wasn't it? I asked, leaning against the doorframe. They're asking for your resignation. She collapsed into the armchair, the very one where she used to sit and deliver her cutting critiques of my parenting. She looked small. The house, which had always felt like her domain, suddenly felt like my own. I could breathe here again. Why, she whispered, staring at a patch of sunlight on the rug. Why go this far? I did everything for this family. I built this reputation so you would have a legacy. You built a cage, Mother. And you expected us to thank you for the bars. I walked to the kitchen and made a pot of tea, for myself, not for her. The sound of the boiling water was the only thing filling the void. When I returned, she was shivering. Not from the cold this time, but from the terrifying realization that she had been utterly, irrevocably erased from the social map she so desperately craved. The traps I had set weeks ago were closing in perfectly. I had ensured that her exit from my home would not be a mere disagreement, but a permanent exile. I had called her bluff, removed her stage, and sent her into the dark. The final phase was simple, silence. I watched her struggle to formulate a defense, a lie, anything to regain the upper hand. But there was nothing left to say. The logic she used to control me, the moral superiority, the social status, had all been turned against her. She looked at me, a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. It wasn't just fear of losing her status, it was the realization that her daughter, the weak and placid Claire, had been playing the long game all along. Don't worry, I said, setting the tea down. You still have your suitcase. And the car is still in the garage. But by morning, there won't be a single home in this town that will open its door to you. The atmosphere in the house was no longer one of conflict, it was one of absolute, cold finality. The predator had become the prey, and she was trapped in a house that no longer recognized her name. This chapter is complete. You may input continue to the next chapter. Chapter 5, The Final Pruning. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its heavy chimes echoing through a house that had suddenly doubled in size. Evelyn's leather suitcase stood by the front door, looking less like luggage and more like a tombstone marking the end of an era. She lingered in the foyer, her manicured fingers tracing the brass handle of her umbrella. Her posture was stiff, her shoulders tense. She was waiting. Waiting for the script to flip back to its default setting. Waiting for me to break, to cry, to apologize for being an ungrateful daughter and beg her to stay. That was the choreography she had designed for this family for 30 years. She inflicts the wound, and we apologize for bleeding on her carpet. You'll regret this, Claire, she whispered into the dim light. Her voice was stripped of its usual theatrical resonance. It was a raw, raspy sound, like dry leaves scraping against cold pavement. When Leo grows up and treats you with this same ruthless disrespect, you will remember tonight. You will remember throwing your own mother out into the dark. I stood leaning against the archway of the living room, a damp microfiber cloth in my hand. For the past hour, I had been meticulously wiping down the silver photo frames on the mantelpiece, a nervous habit I usually fell back on when I was stressed. But tonight, there was no anxiety in my chest. I was simply erasing her fingerprints from my home. If Leo grows up to recognize toxicity, I replied, my tone entirely conversational, and if he develops the courage to cut it completely out of his life to protect his own peace, then I will know I raised him right. Evelyn flinched. The physical recoil was undeniable. Her final trump card, the weaponized guilt of motherhood, the threat of generational karma, had hit a solid brick wall and shattered. She turned to look at me one last time. There was no rage left in her eyes, only a profound, hollow panic. The realization had finally sunken in. I was no longer a participant in her reality. The stage had been dismantled, the lights were out, and the audience had gone home in disgust. She opened her mouth, perhaps to hurl one last insult, perhaps to plead. But the silence in the house was too absolute, too suffocating for her to breach. She swallowed hard, gripped the handle of her suitcase, and pulled the heavy oak door open. The cold November wind immediately rushed in, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and pine. She stepped out onto the porch, the wheels of her suitcase rattling violently against the paving stones of the driveway. I didn't watch her car back out. I simply stepped forward and gently, but firmly, pushed the door shut. The click of the deadbolt sliding into place was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It wasn't just metal sliding into metal, it was the sound of a 30-year sentence coming to an end. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door and took a breath. For the first time in my life, the air in this house belonged entirely to me. The next morning, the Oregon rain finally broke. Pale, watery sunlight pierced through the lingering gray clouds, casting long, sharp shadows across the suburban lawns. I woke up early, pulled on my worn-out rubber boots, and grabbed my pruning shears from the garage. The garden was a mess of battered petals and waterlogged soil. The hydrangeas had taken the brunt of the storm, their heavy heads bowed, many of the stems snapped and rotting from the sheer weight of the water. I knelt in the damp earth, the cold seeping through my jeans, and went to work. You cannot save a rotting branch by ignoring it. You cannot negotiate with a disease that is slowly crawling down to the roots. The only solution, the only way to save the plant, is a clean, merciless cut. Snip. The dead weight fell away into the mud. Mom? I turned. Leo was standing on the back porch, wearing his oversized pajamas, holding a mug of hot cocoa. He looked at the empty space on the driveway where Evelyn's pristine sedan used to be parked. Then, he looked at me. There was a hesitancy in his posture, a residual muscle memory of walking on eggshells. Is she coming back for Thanksgiving? He asked, his voice small. I snipped another broken branch, wiping the blade of the shears on my apron. I stood up, walked over to the porch, and looked my son in the eye. No, sweetie. She's not coming back for Thanksgiving. Or Christmas. Or next summer. I reached out and brushed a stray curl from his forehead. His skin was warm. We're going to have our own Thanksgiving this year. Just you, me, and maybe we'll invite Mrs. Higgins over for pie. How does that sound? Leo stared at me for a long moment. Slowly, the tension drained from his small shoulders. The hollow, terrified look from that rainy night was gone, replaced by a cautious, dawning relief. I can make the cranberry sauce, he said, taking a sip of his cocoa. And I don't have to wear that itchy sweater she bought me, do I? You can wear your favorite hoodie, I smiled, feeling the corners of my eyes crinkle. Even at the dinner table. He smiled back, a real, wide, gap-toothed smile. I turned my gaze back to the garden. The pruned hydrangeas looked a little bare, a little stripped down. But the dead weight was gone. And beneath the wet, dark soil, the roots were finally free to breathe. The storm was over. And my house, at last, was clean.